Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Well, Princess Margaret and Queen Elizabeth had a very close bond since the moment Margaret was born, and they remained close until Princess Margaret got into an affair that caused friction between her and the Queen. So let's find out what happened. Well, the younger years, according to an article in Vogue.com, Elizabeth, she was a stoic one. She was steadfast, and Margaret, on the other hand, was volatile and fabulous, and she would party around the world. And they were like polar opposites. Elizabeth was organized and Margaret artistic. Elizabeth discreet, Margaret attention-seeking. Elizabeth dutiful, Margaret disobedient. Elizabeth disciplined, Margaret wild. Craig Brown recalled in 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret. And to show that even when they were younger, they thought differently is this example. So one Christmas pantomime during the wartime at Windsor Castle, where Elizabeth fretted over the ticket price of 7 and 6 pence. "No one will pay that to look at us," the future queen said to her sister, according to Brown. "Nonsense. They'll pay anything to see us," Margaret replied. And then biographer Andrew Morton said, "Margaret was her sister's alter ego," he wrote in Elizabeth and Margaret, The Intimate World of the Windsor Sisters. Throughout their lives, Elizabeth and Margaret butted heads. The sensible older sister matched with the mischievous, willful little sister. I think Margaret was a bit jealous of Elizabeth because she had no role to play. An example stated that on one occasion, Margaret slammed the door of the Queen's drawing room at Windsor Castle while the Prime Minister was there. She walked in and, addressing her, said, "If you weren't Queen, nobody would talk to you." Andrew Morton, author of Elizabeth and Margaret, The Intimate World of the Windsor Sisters, told Vogue. You see this jealousy, and you also see this loyalty that Margaret had towards Elizabeth. So Elizabeth became queen very suddenly in 1953 after her father died, and this is at the point where Princess Margaret became Queen Elizabeth's subject as well as her sister. The pair were reported to have a love, a friendship, and conspiracy that were impressive to behold, according to Ronaldo Herrera, a royal family friend of the women. I never heard Princess Margaret refer to the Queen in public as anything but the Queen. In private, she became Lilibet, her nickname since childhood, or simply my sister, he told Vanity Fair in 2016. The Queen and Princess Margaret kept in touch daily by phone, and they lived at different residences. The Queen was at Buckingham Palace and Princess Margaret at Kensington Palace, and they would laugh and talk every day. Their lives would take different paths. With the Queen, she was all about duty and dedication to her country. And Princess Margaret, she became the socialite. She became known for her love of parties, fashion, and repeated romances. So the tension developed in the year 1947. Princess Margaret met a married man named Peter Townsend, and Peter Townsend was a Royal Air Force pilot and soon-to-be divorcee, 15 years Margaret's senior. And she was 17 and he 32, and he had served as an equerry for the king. Their resulting romance came at a time when marrying a divorcee was not only frowned upon, but forbidden by the Church of England. And since Margaret was not yet 25 years old, she required marriage approval from her sister, the Queen, who ultimately refused to give it on account of the captain's marital history. The first time, while accompanying the royal family on a 3-month tour to South Africa, his duty was to protect the princesses throughout the trip, so the two spent a lot of time together. In later years, Margaret reportedly tells a confidant, "We rode together every morning in that wonderful country in marvelous weather, and that's when I really fell in love with him." Townsend also accompanied Margaret on a trip to Belfast in October, and he requested to have his room at Hillsborough Castle moved next to her. And Peter Townsend wrote in his memoirs that he had been injured in the war, and he said, "I was exhausted. Life seemed a brief, precarious thing. I stepped out of the cockpit and married the first pretty girl I met." But he said they were already growing apart when he told her he was going to serve the king. By the summer of 1951, I was 36 years old and the father of 2 young sons. When we divorced shortly afterwards, his ex, Rosemary, remarried within 2 months. He said he became close to Margaret after the death of her father, the king, and Peter had been friends with the king, and they found solace in each other's company. He told Princess Margaret his feelings for her, and she said she felt the same way too. According to Peter, she could change in an instant from saintly composure to hilarious, uncontrollable joy. She was a comedian at heart, playing the piano and singing in her rich voice the latest hits, imitating the stars. But what ultimately made Princess Margaret so attractive was that behind the dazzling facade, you could find, if you looked for it, a rare softness and sincerity. So Princess Margaret found love, and she wanted to share her happiness with her family. According to Peter Townsend, a few days after Margaret told her sister about him, the Queen invited us to spend the evening with her and Prince Philip. This stands out in my memory. The Queen's sympathetic acceptance of the disturbing fact of her sister's love for me. And then Princess Margaret also told her mother, I can imagine Queen Elizabeth's reaction. This simply cannot be. But she did not hurt us by saying so. I'm sure the family didn't know what to think about the relationship. So there was a great gap in the ages, and he had been a married man. So the private secretary for the Queen was told the news, and he consulted the Queen, doubtless reminding her that under the Royal Marriage Act of 1772, Princess Margaret would have to obtain Her Majesty's consent to her marriage at least before her 25th birthday. Thereafter, she would be exempt from the Queen's veto, but would still need the consent of Parliament and the Dominion's parliaments as well. The crucial problem was that I was divorced, Peter Townsend wrote. The Queen, as head of the Church of England, could not constitutionally give her consent unless her Prime Minister saw fit to advise her otherwise. And Sir Winston Churchill felt it would be disastrous for the Queen to consent to the marriage of her sister with a divorced man. So then the press got wind of what was happening. At the Queen's coronation, Peter wrote, after the splendid service in Westminster Abbey, a great crowd of crowned heads and nobles and newspapermen, British and foreign, were gathered in the great hall. Princess Margaret came up to me. She looked sparkling and ravishing. As we chatted, she brushed a bit of fluff off my uniform. We laughed and thought no more of it. Next day, the charming little gesture made the headlines in the New York press. So this caused Mr. Churchill to find Peter a job in Brussels. So Princess Margaret was about to tour Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. She was reassured by a promise that my departure would be held until her return in 3 weeks' time. Instead, he was sent away, and they didn't get to see each other for more than a year. They wrote to each other almost every day while he was gone, and their reunion was one of happiness. But Queen Elizabeth had a plan. According to the BBC, Queen Elizabeth and Sir Anthony Eaton, the Prime Minister at that time, actually concocted a plan in 1955 that would have let the Princess Margaret marry Townsend while keeping her royal title and a small allowance. She could live in Britain and continue in public duties if the public allowed, and they probably would, because everybody loved Princess Margaret. The Queen and Eden would also change the Royal Marriages Act so that the Princess Margaret didn't need permission because, according to a statement by Eden, the act was out of harmony with modern conditions. The only catch, Princess Margaret would have to give up her rights of succession as well as the rights of succession of any possible children. The princess ultimately decided to end her relationship with Townsend and to maintain her place on the royal line of succession. Princess Margaret issued a statement on BBC Radio saying, I have been aware that, subject to renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage, but mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others. Peter Townsend said she could have married me only if she had been prepared to give up everything, her position, her prestige, her privy purse, he writes. I simply hadn't the weight, I knew it, to counterbalance all she would have lost. So in 1959, 4 years later, Peter Townsend moved on with his life and married Marie-Louise Jamon in 1959, with whom he had 3 children. They remained happily married until his death at the age of 80 in 1995. And 1 year later, on the May the 6th, 1960, Margaret marries photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, who later becomes the Earl of Snowdon. They had 2 children, and Margaret and Jones eventually divorced in 1978 due to their extramarital affairs, but maintained a friendship up until the end of Margaret's life in February 2002. So Margaret remained friends with Townsend for the rest of his life, and then he died in 1995, according to the BBC. So the Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret stayed bonded, even though Princess Margaret had built a house on a private island. Queen Elizabeth visited her on occasions. And next we have the death of Princess Margaret. And the Queen was never one to show her emotions in public. When her husband, Prince Philip, died in 2021, she didn't cry. The same cannot be said of the death of her sister, February the 9th, 2002. According to YahooNews.com, the Queen revealed emotions rarely shown in public at the funeral of her beloved sister. I think it was the only time anyone ever saw the Queen show her emotions in public, wrote Ronaldo Herrera. But for a few minutes that day, she stood at the steps of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, watching her sister's coffin being borne away. Her eyes betrayed her. They shared a love that never died. In the book 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret, Princess Margaret had the fear her whole life that her sister might be angry with her. She couldn't rest until she heard her sister's voice in waking life. She would call Queen Elizabeth and get the reassurance that Queen Elizabeth wasn't angry at one of her recent antics, and then she could go through the day without the black cloud hanging over her day. Queen Elizabeth lost her closest friend the day she lost her sister, so it was nice to see that their love for one another and Princess Margaret's devotion to her older sister, no matter what, might have popped up in their lives. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I hope that everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.